Nos metemos en contested will. Contested will. You said it's a book of smart people saying nonsense, basically.
Yes.
Like
Anybody who's ever
Freud,
been
Mark
to...
Twain.
Yes, very smart people. All of us have been in rooms with smart people who say dumb things. So I spent a lot of my life in departmental meetings like that. So I started to wonder why Mark Twain, Sigmund Freud, Henry James,
Mark Rylance,
Mark Rylance, Derek Jacobi, some of the greatest actors of Shakespeare of our day.
Did you see the movie Anonymous?
Did the movie Anonymous come to Buenos Aires? It came to New York, and Roland Emmerich, who's a very, very established and impressive filmmaker, wanted to screen it at the New Yorker Festival in New York. And the agreement was he had to debate me if he wanted to screen it. And normally he has an entourage with him, but they didn't let him bring his entourage, and I didn't bring an entourage either. And it was not, for him, a very happy experience. But I was concerned because when you're Roland Emmerich and you make movies that millions of people see, and you make a movie that says that the Earl of Oxford wrote Shakespeare, and
the Virgin
also
Queen.
in the movie that the Earl of Oxford is Queen Elizabeth's son and lover. I mean, I have to face students all the time. And if they're coming in and saying, I didn't know that the author of Hamlet was the son and lover of the Queen of England, I don't know where to start. And we have an expression in America, I don't know how well it translates, and you can find a local idiom, but we use the expression drinking the Kool-Aid. And it came from a terrible incident where people drank poisoned Kool-Aid and died. So willingly, and because of a charismatic leader who told them to do that. So I wrote opinion pieces in the New York Times saying, it's okay if Roland Emmerich drinks the Kool-Aid, I just don't want him serving it up to small children in cups. So he didn't like that either. But I was really glad that it's such a bad movie and that the movement to promote alternative candidates is waning. But I get letters from people all the time, including from, and this is true story, a Supreme Court justice of the United States of America, because several of the Supreme Court justices didn't believe that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare.
No way.
Left and right wing. They didn't believe it. And one of them wrote me a letter saying, I noticed that Shakespeare's handwriting is very wobbly. No one with that kind of handwriting could have written the plays or been able to read or write. So being a very, you can see how polite and deferential I am.
Especially with him.
He was 92 years old when he wrote me this letter, and his hand was shaking. And so he had a secretary type the letter and sign his name for him. And I wrote back, and I actually admire him as a juror, a great legal mind. And I said, just like Shakespeare, you must be illiterate too, because you couldn't sign your own letter to me. And then he wrote me another letter and another, and we broke up. I broke up with him after 6 months of writing back, because it's for people who don't believe that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, it's not a matter of evidence, it's not a matter of history, it's a religious belief. And I don't know if you've ever tried to change somebody's religious beliefs. Don't try, it won't happen.
But there's a very funny character called J.T. Looney in the book with a crazy theory. Well, he tries to, you know.
He was the inventor of the movement that believed the Earl of Oxford wrote Shakespeare's plays. And for those of you who are flirting with this idea, the one problem with the Earl of Oxford writing Shakespeare's plays is that he was dead in 1604, and Shakespeare wrote for another decade, not only alone, but with other writers. So this complicates the argument, and they twist themselves like pretzels into, so I am their worst nightmare, and am happily so. But I wrote this book so that teachers everywhere would not have to deal with young children coming in and saying, as I've heard children say to me, my brother told me that somebody else wrote Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah.
How do you answer that question? So I tried to take what Loney wrote, and Loney, it's funny how to pronounce his name, and try to show what the politics were. Loney was a right-wing nationalist who wanted to bring back the old days. And he wanted to imagine that Shakespeare's plays could only have been written by somebody of his political persuasion. And the judge who wrote to me was a left-wing judge. And I said to him, how can you as a left-wing judge try to align yourself with somebody with fascistic tendencies? And he said, I keep the two apart. And I said, you can't.
Right. Yeah, that's right. That's
and
right.
that's when we broke up.
But let me ask you something, because they claim some evidence regarding to Shakespeare's signature, like 5 or 6 signatures, and he wrote his name differently, in different ways, with different letters. You know, how could the best poet ever wrote his name differently?
You know, I'm not a great speller myself, and never have been. There was no standard orthography in Shakespeare's day. Marlowe's name, Marlowe, Marley, was written 27 different ways. Are we going to say that every playwright whose name appears in multiple ways must have been a different way of doing it? It's just not so. And those kind of arguments are
There's another one. I got 2 more.
Please, I love
like
it.
maybe you
They haven't gotten
you
to you,
convince
huh?
me. All right. That says that how can a boy from a rural school with that kind of education, how he could write?
Right.
You know,
Well, that's the real question. Could only an aristocrat have written these plays? Shakespeare had a grammar school education, and that is the equivalent today of a college education. There were several dozen playwrights also writing at this time, great writers, and all but 3 or 4 of them had the exact same education as Shakespeare. Who becomes a playwright? Somebody who is, or who goes into the theater? Who becomes a writer? People who are strivers, people who are hungry, people who want to forge a new way forward for themselves. So the whole crowd, Marlowe, Kidd, Shakespeare, all these young, hungry writers. Marlowe went to university, Kidd, Shakespeare, others did not. And the fantasy that only somebody who was overeducated and of aristocratic background could have written these plays is contradicted by the evidence of what the theater was and what the theater is today. The man who wrote Shakespeare's plays knew the members of his company. We talked about Will Kemp earlier.
Yeah.
When the writer who is writing Romeo and Juliet gets to a moment when he's writing a part for an actor named Peter in that play, he doesn't write as the speech heading Peter, he writes Kemp. Why? Because in his mind, he's thinking of the actor he's writing the part for. You cannot write these plays, Shakespeare's plays, unless you know the actor actors you're writing for, and he sometimes slips up and writes their names instead of their characters' names.
Yeah.
The Earl of Oxford, living elsewhere, can't FedEx in these plays to the company. That's not how theater works. So the biggest problem for me with those who want to argue that Marlowe, who died in 1593, or Oxford, who died in 1604, wrote these plays, is that they have no feel for theater. They don't acknowledge that 5 of Shakespeare's last 10 plays were written collaboratively with other writers.
Yeah.
It's not only that dead men don't write plays. Dead men don't write plays with other writers. These are hard obstacles to overcome.
Well, you almost got me. The last argument is the will without books or
Yes.
any reference at all about,
You know, again, I live back in 1600, and I know something about the wills back then, and there happened to have been a list appended to the will that was sent to London that if it's ever found is going to have what's called an inventory
yeah.
of Shakespeare's possessions. And other than the bed that he left his wife, the sword that he left a neighbor, the money he left to members of his theater company to buy rings to remember him, it would have been very strange if a Glover's son from Stratford is leaving money to the most preeminent actors in the world to remember him unless he had spent his career with them. And we live in an age of conspiracy, and the internet fuels that conspiracy. We don't ever want to believe what we're told is true, because sometimes in the political world, what we're told is not true. But you can't make this argument that somebody else wrote Shakespeare's plays. I've handled the documents. They haven't been doctored. And sadly...
But why do you think any manuscript survived?
We don't have manuscripts. First of all, of the 3,000 plays from Shakespeare's day, only 500 survive, a handful of them in manuscript, most of those in print. When you publish something, you throw away the manuscript because you no longer need the manuscript. His plays were printed in quarto in his early years, half of them, and all of them again in 1623 in the first folio. You throw out the rough draft, you have this beautiful printed version for posterity. So that is sadly why we don't have manuscripts. But the nature of the questions that you're posing and that those who doubt Shakespeare are posing depend upon 20th century assumptions about writing. Those who want to argue that it was the Earl of Oxford or Francis Bacon try to read the plays as autobiographical. It wasn't until 1900 that people started thinking all writers are writing themselves autobiographically. It wasn't an age where people took selfies of themselves or wrote memoirs or kept diaries. So if you expect those things, those are anachronistic expectations. And you can only, in a sense, fictionalize the life to make it fit. I'll give you one last example. It's not a pretty one, but if there are any Oxfordians...
The Earl of Oxford tendency?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, no? Skip it?
No, go ahead. They are going to love it.
People want to argue that the Earl of Oxford was Shakespeare because he experienced so many of the things that Hamlet experienced, and they read his life through that. We know a lot about the Earl of Oxford, including from men he spent time with, and one of them said that one of the things he did was had sex with an animal. Now, do you want to read Richard III saying, "My kingdom for a horse," as a romantic statement? You can't have it both ways. If you have Hamlet, you have Richard III. You have to embrace the full sexual range. So I'm happy to accept it, but you have to go there.
All right,
Very few Oxfordians will go there.
Let's move to 1606.
And by the way, my publishers did not want me to write contested will. After 1599 came out and won prizes, they said, we want Rocky II. And that's
1600.
Right, they wanted each one. And if I couldn't do it, then I should, like McDonald's, I'd hire people out to set up little shops to do each one. And I said, no reviewer is going to think Rocky II is as good as Rocky I. And it's going to take me 10 years to write, because it has to be done by 2016.
Yeah.
And so I snuck in Contested Will to allow me time, because if I waited 10 years, everybody would have thought, Shapiro, didn't he die between here and... So I was able to stay alive in the critical world, write Contested Will very quickly.
Why did you choose 1606?
You know, 3 years after I chose it, I regretted choosing 1606. Shakespeare really disappears in 1606.
Yeah.
You have to choose, because you have to hope that you're going to find stuff. And I chose 1606 because I knew that 25 years would have passed between beginning 1599 and ending 1606, and I knew I'd be older. And the 3 plays Shakespeare writes in 1606, King Lear, Macbeth, and Antony and Cleopatra, are about older characters and older men. And I thought, until now I'm too young to wrestle with these older characters. Maybe when, you know, the hair starts going and the belly starts filling out, I'll have a better understanding of these characters. And maybe a little bit better it turned out, but not as much as I had hoped. As you get older, you don't understand being older. It didn't work for me that way, maybe for some of you. You always think you're younger than you are, and we still think that way. But I chose 1606 in part because I always thought of Shakespeare as an Elizabethan. That's what we say.
Elizabethan theaters.
Under Elizabeth. But Elizabeth died in 1603, and Shakespeare continued to write plays for another 10 years. He was a Jacobean. We say Jacobean because he wrote under King James, Jacobus. And I asked myself, maybe we have to look at the 2 parts of his career, one under one regime and the other under another. So what happens to a playwright who's so political writing under a different regime? And that to me became a very interesting question. And 1606 was, I could have chosen 1603, I could have chosen 1611, but I chose 1606.
And Shakespeare before 1606, during the Jacobean government, you know, he was like very low profile.
Shakespeare would write 2, 3, 4 plays a year towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, 1598, 1599, very rich, very productive years. After he wrote Hamlet in 1600, he had a slow period. He had a period where he's writing a play a year. They're not terrible plays, Twelfth Night, Troilus and Cressida, Timon of Athens, but to me they're not his greatest plays. It's a fallow period. And I think when King James comes to the throne in 1603, he writes Othello, which is an extraordinary play. But Measure for Measure is his first play under King James, Timon of Athens is second. He hasn't quite found his footing in the new regime. And I'm sure younger writers are saying, Shakespeare, he's recycling those old Elizabethan plays. We're going to overtake him. He's boring. And in 1606, he finds his footing, and he writes 3 extraordinary tragedies.
He finally understands maybe what was the story that people wanted, because, well, James was struggling with this issue of the union of the kingdoms and all that sort of thing. So maybe, you know.
Yeah, you know, 1606 was interesting to me because it was a very good year for Shakespeare, but it was a really bad year for England. And those 2 are connected. King James, when he came down from Scotland to rule over the kingdoms of Scotland and England, turned to Parliament and he said, look, I can't be a bigamist. I can only be married to one country. I can't be married to 2 wives, England and Scotland. You have to form a Great Britain. That's all. Nobody else wanted Great Britain except for King James. And he kept pushing and pushing and pushing this. And soon every writer in England, including Shakespeare and other playwrights, began to write about the division of the kingdom or the union of the kingdom. And Shakespeare writes King Lear out of this really pressing controversy. In the background also are two other concerns at this time. One is epidemic, plague that had killed 1 out of every 7 Londoners in 1592, 93, and then in 1603, came back in 1606. And, you know, we're living through an epidemic, the Zika virus and all. Yeah. It's scary. And it was scary living through that. And it enters into his plays in small ways. And the third great issue of the moment that fed into the plays he's writing in 1606, especially Macbeth, is in November of 1605, a group of 20 very unhappy Catholic men decided King James promised us more religious tolerance. He didn't give it to us. He's a young man. He's going to live forever. We need to take action. We're going to put 36 barrels of gunpowder under the Parliament House. And when King James comes in with his wife and son, and all the religious and political leaders are going to gather there on November 5th, we're going to have a terrorist attack and blow it up and destroy the government and turn back the clock to before the Reformation. And they came close. And England had to experience what we've all experienced in our lifetimes, which is, how do you deal with terror? Do you demonize the terrorists? Do you demonize their religion? Do you punish everybody of that faith? Do you trust your neighbors? Do you want revenge? Do you try to understand those who tried to attack and destroy you? And Shakespeare, in plays like Macbeth, struggle with those questions, even as we're struggling with them today.
Yeah, and in this period also, his company became the King's Men. How that happened?
Yeah, King James comes down from Scotland. He loved theater, or he loved the idea of theater. We know he often fell asleep going to plays, but he seemed to have enjoyed theater nonetheless.
The book with a beautiful description of
a mask.
Exactly.
Yeah. King James felt that theater was part of displaying his own power. And on the 5th day of January of 1606, the elite in London came to court to watch the most extravagant production. Best music, best set design, best actors, aristocratic women dressed in beautiful outfits designed by the best designers. It cost the equivalent of the opening game ceremony at the Olympics and the Super Bowl. That's how expensive for one production. And Ben Jonson wrote this mask. And it celebrated union, political union, marital union. It was King James's way of saying, I'm not like that virgin queen you have. I believe in union, and it's pushing my political agenda. Shakespeare did not write this. Ben Jonson wrote this, and he got paid a lot for it. And he was willing to write propaganda for a lot of money. And there are some writers who are willing to write propaganda for a lot of money. Shakespeare was not one of them. But Shakespeare and his company, a month after King James became ruler of England, were made King's Men. And they were the official company of the king, which meant they had to come to court 10, 12 times a year and perform before King James. And when King James wanted them to serve as court officials, they had to put on their red outfits, show up at court, leave the theater, close the theater, and do the king's bidding. So it was also a mixed blessing.
And that is when Lear appears.
King
so it's
Lear.
Like you wrote about a previous layer or something. Yeah, another king there.
You know, in 1605, in the summer, Shakespeare's always, you know, like any producer, playwright, he's always searching for new material. And in late 1605, in May, a book is published, a playbook, a play text, called King Lear, but not L-E-A-R, L-E-I-R. But it would have been pronounced the same way. King Lear spelled his name different ways, too.
All right.
And it's a story about a king and his 3 daughters, and the separation, the fight between the king and his youngest daughter. And let's say we were Londoners back then. And I said, I'm going to take you to the Globe to see my favorite story, the story of King Lear. But this old play of King Lear had a happy ending. King Lear is alive at the end of the play, and he's reconciled with his youngest daughter. So imagine if we're going, we love this old play, we go to the theater to see Shakespeare's version, and we're expecting King Lear to be alive at the end and reconciled with his daughter. And first she dies, and then he dies, and then everybody else dies. And it's like they're hit by a truck in the middle of this play. So it's not only that Shakespeare is taking old stories and revising them, he's taking a story that you expected to be happy and making it into the darkest play ever written in English and maybe in any language.
And you pointed the use of words, English, British, England, Britain.
Yeah. Under Elizabeth, Shakespeare has to worry about Englishness. And he's very interested in what does it mean to be English or French or Spanish or Italian. When King James comes to the throne, English is out, British is in. So both King Lear and Macbeth are plays about British identity, how you put together, if it's possible, the various parts of this kingdom. And because it's what everybody was talking about, what everybody was concerned with, and what everybody was interested in reading, and seeing. And if Shakespeare's company wasn't doing these plays, playgoers would go to another theater where they would. But it was a difficult time because to write about Britishness and to write about the division of the kingdoms was to risk censorship. And you did not know whether you would be punished by the state, by the authorities, for overstepping the bounds. And one of Shakespeare's great gifts, Shakespeare had 2 great gifts. One of his great gifts was he wrote all these plays before they introduced coffee or tea into England. How he stayed awake to write is a miracle.
No electric light, nothing.
No, you candlelight, yes. Coffee you need. So that was one gift. The other gift is that he never ended up in jail. Because in this, right around 1606, Johnson, Chapman, Marston, they're all getting into trouble. The children's companies, everybody is ending up in prison, in jail, threatening, and that's the way you hurt theater companies. You take away their living. You starve them for funds. The Queen had a playing company that made fun of the Scots. She removed the patronage and money, and they struggled. So artists had to know how to be edgy without going over the edge.
Yeah. William Kemp, he left the company. Now they have a new comedian that allowed Shakespeare to write scenes with kings and fools.
Robert Armin was Kemp's replacement, and he came into the company about 8 months after Will Kemp left. And you can tell because there are plays that don't have comedians in them. Julius Caesar doesn't have a comedian. Hamlet has
the diggers, maybe.
Just the gravedigger, but we think of Hamlet as a clown prince. He's making jokes all the time. So Shakespeare's only finding his relationship with his comic star, Armin, slowly. And the great role he writes for him is as the fool in King Lear. And for the first time, you don't have a scene with a king and the next scene with a clown. You have King Lear and Burbage and Armin together.
Yeah, the egg scene and the nothing scene.
It's brilliant and it's novel and it's shattering. It's just shattering. And great actors today struggle to fill the shoes of the great actors for whom Shakespeare wrote these parts.
All right. Let's get into Macbeth, his next play. It's a play about mainly two Scottish kings being murdered.
Yes, it
So
begins with the murder of a Scottish king and ends with one.
With one. And there's the witchcraft atmosphere all around the play. How can you relate James the First with witchcraft?
It's a great question. James the First not only thought he was a great king, but he thought he was the best writer in England. And he was maybe the best-selling writer in England because everybody wanted to know what the king wrote. And the king wrote a book about not dividing your kingdom, and the king wrote another book about witchcraft. And he was deeply interested in witchcraft, and he was deeply interested in demonic possession.
Yeah.
Because there were people who went around, mostly young girls, who claimed to be possessed with the devil. And they would spit out pins and shake, and they were great actors.
Anne Gunther.
Anne Gunther was one of them. Anne Gunther lived near Oxford, and she was demonically possessed. And they blamed three of her neighbors, you, and you, were witches and possessed her and should be punished. And a jury looked at this and they said, no, they're not witches. And his father brought her to see King James and said, she's possessed. And
Her father.
Her father.
Yeah.
And he was in on it. And they got all their tricks from a book by a man named Harsnet on demonic possession. How to fake demonic possession. Shakespeare was reading the very same book at the very same time. And when he writes the character of Edgar in King Lear as possessed and masquerading in this way, he's getting it from the same sources as they are. King James turned Anne Gunther over to his expert demonologist and exposed her as a fraud. But Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, they're all taking these stories and feeding them in. And Shakespeare's Macbeth begins with witches, and it has all kinds of malevolent forces in them. And in a way, it's both the story of the day, but it's also about the gunpowder plot, and the malevolent forces are the people who tried to blow up Parliament.
Can you
driven
go a
by
little bit
the
further
devil?
with that? How were the executions? Because they were really cruel.
You know, on the cover of my American edition, there's a picture of what happened on January 25th and January 26th, 1605. And on this day, the gunpowder plotters, the 8 of them who weren't killed before this, were brought on, towed by horses, pulled by horses, to the place of execution. And all of London came out.
A big event. Yeah.
Great theater. I mean, it was, it was great theater. And first they were hanged by the neck, but not until death. And they were cut down, and they were castrated, and then they were cut open, and their organs taken out. And one of the it was tremendous theater. And this was the way for the state to show its power over the individual.
Is it true that ones like survive, or like,
Well, you know,
he managed to say something
Sir-
without lungs? It's
Sir
like
Kenneth Digby was young,
the worst was
handsome.
Guy Fawkes.
Sir
but
Count, not Guy Fawkes, but Digby, reportedly, and people were there, so maybe it's true, when the executioner tore out his heart and held it up to the crowd and said, "Here is the heart of a traitor." Digby, with his dying breath, said, "Thou liest." This is what people heard. And you can just sense the ways in which this violence, I mean, Shakespeare's plays this year are incredibly violent. Gloucester has his eyes gouged out. Macbeth is so bloody, actors feel it's
but
dangerous
nowadays
to have.
it's a competition between real life and the stage. You know, it's like
How do you
after
beat
seeing that, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And it's in the memory.
It is.
And when you go to see Macbeth And in the opening scene, they have squibs that smell like sulfur and gunpowder. It's actually recreating the smell of the times along with the witches and the dangers. So Shakespeare used sight, smell, daylight, everything he could to make his playgoers immersed in the stories he was telling.
Let's go a little bit into Anthony and Cleopatra. We're having Anthony Unbound next.
Very exciting.
And they're making signs like we have to, you know.
Okay, well.
And then, so we have time for them to ask questions.
Can I talk a little bit about Anthony Unbound? Sure. I got to see it last night.
Because he's a character in both years, right?
The one character who straddles 1599 and 1606 is the character of Antony. In Julius Caesar, he appears. He's a playboy in that. And he becomes the man who avenges the death of his close friend Julius Caesar. And almost surely Shakespeare was going to write a sequel right then, Rocky II or Julius Caesar II. And another writer, Fulk Greville, actually wrote a play about Antony and Cleopatra, saw that you couldn't, burned it. And Shakespeare had to wait 7 years to finish the story of Antony now having survived the struggle against Brutus. Antony is now one of the 3 most powerful men in the world. And he's married, and he has a wife who's creating difficulty, and he falls in love with Cleopatra, and he's married off politically.
There's tension between duty and pleasure.
All the issues. So in a way, the 2 books straddle the story of this man who has one of the great, great arcs in the development of a character. And George is extraordinary, and Penny in directing the arc of this story. So those of you who are going to be seeing this are in for a real treat, because Shakespeare creates some of his finest language and emotional trajectory for this great character.
Great. Well, now let's have some questions.
Please.
I need you to
I will.
Yeah, all right. So, si hay preguntas, levanten la mano y vamos yendo por allá, por allá, por
yes.
allá.
The question is, what is new in Hamlet? I would say the most important new thing in Hamlet is the soliloquy, more than anything else. And there are 5 great soliloquies that are given to Hamlet, and an additional great soliloquy given to Claudius. And for me, that is the great innovation of this play. And even though there are some remarkable soliloquies in Macbeth, it's Hamlet that gives us, if you will, interiority. For the first time in English drama, you're looking into somebody's soul. And that is truly extraordinary. So the language of the play, Shakespeare's always inventing and transforming words. There's not a play that doesn't have new words. Macbeth uses the word equivocation in a brilliant way, but if you're thinking of what is innovative, it's the greatest innovation not only in Hamlet, but in all of Shakespeare. I'm not sure if this is going to answer your question exactly, but the question is about humanizing Shakespeare. I think it's very hard not to make Shakespeare our contemporary and make him feel human, make him feel like a good husband, a good father, a good friend.
Your point of view changes. In 1599, he was like a little bit shy.
Aloof.
Yeah, and in, 1606, he's more like, he likes to socialize.
You know, all I can do in answering that question is look at the evidence. When I wrote 1599, the only evidence we had was a story that came down to us from one of Shakespeare's neighbors in Stratford, who was asked, would he go out? What kind of social life did he have? And that neighbor said, you know, you would ask him to go out, and he would say, I'm not feeling well. And that's the Shakespeare that I wrote about in 1599. a year ago, right before I finished this book on 1606, a scholar found in an archive in Scotland a different story, that in London, at the Tabard Inn, which was a drinking place about a half mile from the Globe Theatre, Shakespeare would go in there with his drinking buddies, the actors, and he carved his name into the woodwork, like you do in New York at Sardi's, or I don't know where you do that in Buenos Aires. But it's clear that Shakespeare did not like to spend time drinking with his neighbors in Stratford, but in London, where he lived, he had a circle, and he would go out drinking. So every time we have new evidence, it changes our sense of what Shakespeare as a human being was like.
See?
Next question, if there's a mic in the back, that gentleman there. Wait 1 second. Oh, you're asking in English. Go ahead.
To what extent can or should we consider Shakespeare a champion of women?
To what extent should we assume or believe Shakespeare is the champion of women? Remember, no woman acted on Shakespeare's stage. Yeah. And we don't...
At the Mask, yes.
Only, right, but not on Shakespeare's stage, the Jacobean court mask. That is a really good question, and neither of us is of the right gender to answer that question. But I would say that Shakespeare asks the right questions, and actors have found in Shakespeare great insight into the hearts and minds and desires of women as well as men. I'm interested in 1606 because the only successful marriage in Shakespeare's plays is of the Macbeths. They have a project that's killing people and ruling. But, you know, whatever works to keep that marriage, childless marriage, together. So Shakespeare was profoundly interested in women, in the constraints upon women, but what he actually felt in his heart, I don't know. He spent most of his time in the company of men. I hear that. Can I elaborate on the character of Iago in Othello? It's, you know, there are so many extraordinary characters in Shakespeare, and Iago is one of them. There are characters who are larger than life, and the great English critic Coleridge spoke of Iago's motiveless malignity. Why does he do this? And every time I go to see that play, I'm left scratching my head. Why does he do it? Why does he destroy somebody else in this way? And there are just certain characters that defy explanation. This July, I'm going to be in Venice. It's a big year. I'm happy to be here now. I'm going to be in many countries this year to celebrate Shakespeare's 400th anniversary of the death of Shakespeare. And in Venice, they're going to retry Shylock. And a U.S. Supreme Court justice, a different one, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, is going to be presiding at that trial, and I'll be participating at that trial. And characters like Shylock and Iago, they're just larger than life. And they continue to, in different times, in different places, speak with great power to us. And we're here not because of us. We're here because Shakespeare has been meaningful in all of our lives in different ways. And my job is to try to make it easier to explain why Shakespeare should be in our lives and the lives of our children and friends as well. So these are 4 great questions, and I'm going to answer them all in one long, complicated response.
Or you could say yes, that's it.
Or maybe. And they're great questions, and they tell me, and I can feel the energy of this audience. It's really a great audience, and I've locked the doors, and George is not going to be able to perform today. I would love to have been at an Elizabethan play, to have felt the energy in that room. Some were literate, some were well-educated, some were illiterate, men, women, young, old, cross-section of society. That's the audience Shakespeare wrote for. Were they loud? Were they noisy? Much more than modern audiences. I take productions to prisons in the United States, and they love yelling out. They don't know there's a fourth wall. When an actor faints, she's down, you know, it's just... And it makes me feel that I'm close to that audience. They cared because it was their lives and their culture that were at stake. The heteronormative, first the death. Tragedies, comedies end in marriage, tragedies end in death. And audiences love both. Shakespeare wrote tragedies and he wrote comedies. And it's not that comedies were happy. There are a lot of unhappy marriages in these plays, or unhappy unions. And one of those unhappy unions is Portia, who marries the playboy Bassanio at the end of The Merchant of Venice. One of the things that I love about Shakespeare is that characters are neither good, except for Iago. They're really a mixture, like most of us, of darker impulses and of more generous impulses. Portia is a woman who can't even have any authority in her life unless she dresses like a man. And she's stuck at a moment with a man, Shylock, who she must overcome. She must overcome him not because he's a Jew and she's a Christian. She must overcome him because she sees that her husband of one day, Bassanio, is in love with a man, Antonio, who loves him. And if she doesn't spare Antonio's life, it's going to be a really bad marriage. Because Bassanio will always be saying, he loved me so much. What have you done to show me that kind of love? That's the brilliance of Shakespeare. And when you only peel off one layer or not, it doesn't work. Which leads me to my op-ed piece. The first op-ed piece was on Emmerich. The second op-ed piece is on the Oregon Shakespeare Festival's decision to take Shakespeare, Shakespeare's English, and translate him into English, into modern English, on the assumption that Americans don't understand Shakespeare. And this really, really made me unhappy. And when I get unhappy, I write an op-ed. And then I go meet with the person I wrote about. So I met with the head of the Oregon Shakespeare Company. And I said, don't do this. Don't dumb Shakespeare down. I love Shakespeare in translation. Best Shakespeare films coming out of India. I mean, I'm working with a theater company that's going to start doing Shakespeare in Spanish as well as in English, because you can reach different audiences. But in English, for native speakers of English, which most Americans are, the problem is not Shakespeare. The problem is that the actors and the directors don't know what the words mean. The problem is never with the audience. And I know this because I take plays into Rikers Island Prison, the most dangerous place in New York City, where many of the audience members are Dominican or Puerto Rican, African Americans with very poor educational backgrounds. And I work with the actors and work with the directors who know every word of Shakespeare's original. They get it all. The problem is not the audiences. The problem is with the director. And I promised the head of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival that I would continue to make his life miserable until he made it. Thank you.
Wait. Wait there. You should stand up. You should stand up. la Fundación Romeo desde el año 2014 entrega los premios Shakespeare. Lo han recibido Agustín Aleso, Kive Steiff, Norma Leandro, Judi Dench, Kenneth Branagh, Michael Pennington, Estela Medina en Uruguay y Nuria Espert en España. Y este año, ¿quién se adelantó? Este año, el martes, lo recibió el maestro Roberto Carnaghi. Así que no podíamos dejar pasar esta visita, que la verdad que nos honra, sin darle también a James Shapiro el premio Shakespeare, que lo tengo acá escondido, y que se lo merece. It's like the Oscars of Shakespeare.
I love it. Thank you so much. I love it. Beautiful. Thank you.